So, good morning, good afternoon here in Italy. Good morning, Professor Walter Glannon, dear colleagues and friends. It's a great privilege for me to welcome all of you in this global dialogue on neuroethics, this webinar with Professor Walter Glannon, a dialogue on the topics on neuroethics, ethics of neuroscience, neuroscience of ethics. My name is Professor Alberto Carrara. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Director of the Neurobioethics Research Group at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum here in Rome. And also I'm the member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. It is a real pleasure and honor to greet all the participants joining here today from different parts of the world. It is also my great privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Walter Glannon. And Professor Glannon is a Canadian philosopher, neuroethicist, internationally recognized as one of the pioneers of contemporary neuroethics. He took part in the historic first conference, Neuroethics Mapping the Field, organized by the Dana Foundation in San Francisco. It was May 13, 14, 2002, several years. An event that marked the formal birth of neuroethics as a field of interdisciplinary research and reflection. The neologism neuroethics trace back to Annalise Alma Pontius, 1973, the neuropsychiatrist, first from the New York Medical School and after that Harvard Medical School. Professor Glannon academic formation combines rigorous training in philosophy with a sustained engagement with empirical neuroscience and clinical practice. He also speaks Spanish because he did his PhD on a very famous Spanish philosopher. From the very beginning of the field, Professor Glannon has been a central voice in defining the conceptual, moral, and anthropological questions raised by advance in brain science. Sorry, for the people that want the translation in Italian, there's the translation. They have to change the channel on the bottom. There's the bottom, the two bottom called translation or interpretariato in Italian. So you have to put the channel into Italian. So there's the Italian translation. Professor Glannon research has addressed a broad range of topics, including consciousness, personal identity, free will, moral responsibility, mental disorder, and the ethical implication of neurotechnologies, such as deep brain stimulation, cognitive enhancement. And through his work, he has consistently emphasized the need to integrate philosophy with neuroscience, neuroscientific evidence, while remaining attentive to the lived experience of patients and persons, and the moral responsibility of clinicians and society. He is the author of several highly influential books, including Bioethics and the Brain. I have here all the books of Professor Glannon, and I remember Bioethics and the Brain was one of my favorite Oxford Press, and there's a lot. And I remember also having here in Rome Professor Glannon in 2012. Bioethics in the Brain, the Neuroscience of Memory, From Total Recall to Oblivion, Defining Right and Wrong in Brain Science, Brain, Body and Mind, Neuroethics with a Human Face, and many other books and articles. Professor Glannon's scholarship is especially noted for his emergentist and non-reductive account of the mind-brain relationship. In November 2025, he recently published another book, called Neuroethics, The Implications of Mapping and Changing the Brain, with Mead Press, a landmark contribution that reflects over 25 years of scholarship in this field. My personal and academic encounter with Professor Glannon dates back into 2012 here in Italy when the Neurobioethics Research Group, together with the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights and the Institute of Science and Faith at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum, organized the International Conference Consciousness and Neuroethics, Brain, Body, and Mind, and Environmental Interactions. And that meeting was a decisive moment also in my own intellectual journey. I guess there's, no, I don't know. Yeah. In the web page of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, we have the summary of the event. And indeed, it was precisely through my engagement with Professor Glannon's work that I decided to go deeper into the field of neuroethics during my PhD in philosophy. And my doctoral research focused on the anthropological vision of Walter Glannon, in particular on his proposal of compositional or nest emergentism as a paradigm for contemporary neuroethics reflection. I defend my thesis in 2021. My director was Ramon Lucas, and I was also deeply honored to have Professor Evandro Agazzi, one of the great philosophers of science, as my second reviewer. And today, my work in neuroethics continues also at the international level. I was appointed by Pope Francis to the Pontifical Academy for Life, where I coordinate since 2017 the Vatican project dealing with neuroethics. Currently, our research is especially focused in two main areas: the neurotechnologies, but the use of neurotechnologies not for medical reason or purpose. And the second is the ethical challenge of related to aging and longevity. And in this context, it is particularly meaningful to welcome for Professor Glannon today, whose philosophical depth and neuroethical insight continue to inspire scholars, clinicians, and policymakers worldwide. Dear Professor Glannon, thank you so much for being with us today. We are very much looking forward to your lecture and to dialogue with you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Alberto, for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for accommodating me because it probably isn't an ideal time for you. It's much better for me. But anyway, I very much appreciate that and to be with you today. Um, a few weeks ago, Father Alberto asked me to say something about how I became interested in neuroethics. And he mentioned the conference in San Francisco in 2002. Oh, and by the way, I have very fond memories of our meeting in Rome in 2012. That was fantastic. But as a philosopher, one of the issues I've always been interested in is free will. And for the theologians in the audience, free will, the issue always usually is how can we reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom? And so I read Molina, Occam, Boethius, and others on this issue and was very much interested in it. But at the same time, I was interested in on how our mental states, such as desires, beliefs, and intentions, lead to our actions. And a number of philosophers, Harry Frankfurt in the United States and others, had dealt with this issue. But I always wondered whether the brain should have some role in these explanations. And I was writing my dissertation, which was on the mental basis of responsibility. And I came across Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error. And I thought, this is something that philosophers should read and take into account when they discuss free will. That is the mind-brain interaction and what that implies for whether we have free will or we don't have free will. And so I started studying and thinking a lot about the brain-mind relation. And it was that conference in San Francisco that really got me going on that connection. So that's an explanation of how I got into all of this. Okay, so Father Alberto wanted me to talk about neuroethics. So some of this is very familiar to some of you. Maybe it's not. I don't want to assume anything. So I'll just go through some slides here. Let me see. Hold it. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. If I can just get the next one here. Wait a minute. How do I do this? Okay. So Father Alberto in his introduction mentioned the origins of the term neuroethics, and he mentioned the conference. Also, in that year, 2002, there were two very influential papers. One by the neuroscientist Martha Farah, the title of which is Emerging Ethical Issues in Neuroscience, which was published in Nature Neuroscience, and especially Adina Roski's book, Neuroethics for the New Millennium. And this is Father Alberto in his introduction was talking about the intersection of philosophy um, and neuroscience. These two papers do that in a very concise and I think a very good way. So Roski's made the distinction between the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscience of ethics. And the ethics of neuroscience deals with issues such as, and this is not an exhaustive list, informed consent from patients undergoing interventions in the brain, structural or functional imaging, neurosurgery, functional neurosurgery, which includes deep brain stimulation, and psychopharmacology. Um, and it's not completely different from informed consent in any other area of bioethics. And similarly, practitioners' duty to inform patients of the benefits and risks of these interventions, as well as the duty of non-maleficence, which is actually a stronger ethical duty than beneficence, to protect patients from harm. The neuroscience of ethics, on the other hand, addresses the neurobiological basis of practical and moral reasoning and decision making. So, how do brain structures and functions mediate the cognitive, emotional, and volitional capacities of acting or failing to act or refraining from acting? Okay, I noticed, can you all see these slides? Because there's a bit of, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So for example, how do prefrontal areas interact with limbic and subcortical regions in enabling behavior control? How the brain enables or disables the mental basis of responsibility, praise, blame, and punishment. And as Father Alberto said, my approach to this, which is not unique, is that it's not a reductionist notion. The ethical concern is with how neurobiology enables or disables the mental capacities in terms of which we praise people, blame them, or hold them accountable, punish them for what they do or fail to do. And Roski's pointed out that there is considerable overlap between the ethics of neuroscience and neuroscience of ethics. So here's an example. Suppose you have a patient with um, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, let's say. So their rational capacity may be in question. But it waxes and wanes. Sometimes they seem to be very lucid, and other times they aren't. So suppose they refuse psychotropic treatment. The psychiatrist must decide whether the patient has enough capacity to make an informed and autonomous decision in refusing the treatment. So the psychiatrist has to respect the patient's decision or they could override it in involuntary treatment. Could be involuntary commitment to a psychiatric hospital, for example. This is a very much discussed issue today, and it goes to this idea of this overlap between the ethics of neuroscience and neuroscience of ethics. So it raises questions about the neurobiological basis of reasoning and the psychiatrist's obligation to prevent harm to the patient while respecting their autonomy. Okay, so let me just go through some of the issues in different aspects of neuroscience. So neuroimaging. Some people tend to think that imaging, especially functional imaging, gives you a snapshot or a direct picture of the brain, which is not true. It's indirect. With functional magnetic resonance imaging, it measures blood flow. With positron emission tomography, it measures glucose metabolism. Those are measures of brain activity, but they're not identical to it. So this is where people have to be careful in making inferences from what they see on a brain scan or a series of scans and what's actually going on in an individual's brain. There are many false positives, which has been shown in the literature. And also, I mentioned incidental findings. These are findings that are not, so an individual may participate in a brain imaging study and a lesion in their brain may appear unbeknownst to them or the investigator. So what do you do with that information? There was an article in Nature in 2006 where an individual, a healthy individual who was a participant in an imaging study, a tumor was discovered in his brain, and well, yeah, it was an abnormality in his brain, and his insurance unauthorized third parties got access to the information. And he said he was discriminated against because of that information. I'm going to talk about neural rights in a few minutes. So this is part of that. And it goes way back. So his advice in this article was make sure when individuals participating in imaging clinical trials, especially healthy individuals, that they are informed of what could happen and what their rights are with the information that is derived from these scans. Okay, and the last point here, a brain abnormality on imaging doesn't prove that a person couldn't control their impulses or other aspects of their behavior when they acted. So this is in the criminal law, and many people have pointed out that imaging has limited probative value about determining the culpability of an individual. Again, the point is neurobiology, neuroimaging should inform decisions about people's mental capacities when they acted. It's in terms of their mental life, their mental capacities, that we should be evaluating, assessing whether they are responsible or not, morally and criminally. Prolonged disorders of consciousness. This has been an area where much has been written in the neuroethics literature. So there's coma, persistent vegetative state, the permanent vegetative state, where there's arousal but no awareness, and the minimally conscious state, which is a diagnosis which just was determined in 2002 by Giacchino and a group, his co-researchers. So there are intermittent periods of awareness. And the problem is these patients are behaviorally non-responsive, but they are, as some researchers have said, they are alive inside, so they are aware, or what Adrian Owen, I mentioned in his article, has said, called covert awareness. So, and the danger there is, the diagnostic and prognostic uncertainty makes it very difficult for decisions by families to continue or discontinue life support. And the danger is that is making a misdiagnosis. So a patient could be minimally conscious when they've been diagnosed as permanently vegetative or even comatose. And they have awareness, they have a will to live, they have an interest in continuing to live. And so that would support the view that life-sustaining treatment for them should continue. So again, the diagnosis of this ambiguity in determining whether a patient is aware and to what extent is very, very important, and the significant ethical implications of it. And this is related to brain death. So when does a person die or cease to exist? Do we use whole brain criterion, which is the standard um, philosophical, medical, well, I shouldn't say philosophical because there's some disagreement. It's the medical and legal standard. So a person dies when all brain functions, integrated brain functions, including the brainstem, permanently cease to function. Some people, usually philosophers, come up with a higher brain criterion, which says that a person is defined essentially in terms of the capacity for consciousness, and that is sustained by higher brain, by cortical functions. And if they cease to exist, then the person ceases to exist. Very controversial idea. Even more controversial is the somatic integration criterion. That is, some people believe that a person, and the distinction between persons and human beings is another contentious issue. But some people, including some neurologists, argue that even if all brain functions, integrated brain functions, cease, bodily functions can continue, suggesting that the individual continues to exist. And there have been cases globally, but there was one in particular in the United States, a young girl named Jahi McMath, who there were complications. She had a tonsillectomy. She had a intracerebral hemorrhage and lost all integrated brain function, but bodily functions continued. And her mother and others argued that she was still living. And this went on for a while, and it went through the courts, but it's a good example of the somatic integration criterion. And based on all of these, Robert Veach and Laney Roth, others have done this, but I thought their book was very good in outlining the issues. And they mentioned this Jahi McMath case, particularly the perspective of her mother. They said that death is not just a biological, but also a religious, philosophical, social, and cultural phenomenon. So it's very difficult for people to insist on saying that, just to give a medical legal definition and excluding other social, cultural, religious aspects of it. So it makes the determination of death more controversial. Cognitive and moral enhancement, for me, has not been as important ethically as some of the other issues, but um, it's been discussed by many people in the literature. So methylphenidate, modafinil, other psychotropic drugs are used to enhance such things as one's ability to focus, make decisions. And some of the questions are that people like Leon Cass raised. Does it result in alienation or inauthenticity from our true selves? That's one issue. Another is whether it provides an fair advantage to people who can afford to enhance themselves, to access cognition-enhancing drugs. Would it increase social inequality? The consensus is that it may slightly enhance those who have a higher baseline of cognitive function, but it wouldn't. The evidence just isn't clear that it would increase social inequality. Moral enhancement is something which I found very interesting, but the arguments for it have not been very persuasive. The idea is that actually I didn't mention Igmar Persson and Julian Savulescu published a book in 2012, um, which was about moral enhancement, that given the failure of education and other institutions to make us more morally responsive to the needs of others, that there may be reasons to use pharmacological means to enhance our moral sensibility. And John Harris, the bioethicist, published How to Be Good on the same issue. He takes issue with Person and Savulescu in many ways, but he's in principle in favor of it. I think the best critique of this whole moral enhancement debate is Harris Weissman's book, The Myth of the Moral Brain. And he, I think, correctly points out that morality is not something that is located in the brain. There is no moral brain, but it's neurobiology, our mental life, so the fact that we are cultural beings, social beings, we interact with other people. It's much more complex. The idea of how we can become more sensitive to the needs of others than just using a drug to increase oxytocin levels in the brain or serotonin levels in the brain, that it's much more complicated than that. And I think Weissman did a good job. So the idea of moral enhancement, I think, is very controversial. And the arguments for it, I think, are weaker than any other arguments for any other type of neuro um, interventions to improve us, if you want to call it, as human beings. Okay, so Father Alberto mentioned in his introduction neurotechnologies, and that's one of the issues that warrants, because of their importance, um, more attention and greater ethical, legal, and public debate. So the use of artificial intelligence is everywhere now. In ethics journals, it's hard to not to see something, at least one article about artificial intelligence in every issue. And I think yeah, there are a number of issues. One for me that's important is how it's going to affect diagnostic and predictive neuroimaging. So medical experts, neurologists, radiologists say that there are limitations with AI and machine learning, but it could improve our diagnostic ability. For example, the misdiagnosis in disorders of consciousness. So it could improve the issue of, or resolve the issue of trying to decide between whether a patient who is behaviorally non-responsive is comatose or actually is minimally conscious. So I think it could help in that regard. What's more problematic, I think, is predictive neuroimaging. So um, they could, artificial intelligence could detect biomarkers in the brain, in the central nervous system, which could indicate that an individual may develop a certain, let's say, neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative disease years down the road, maybe 20, 30 years. How accurate is that? Um, can we, it's still probabilistic, more probable maybe than before the age of AI, but it's not deterministic. So how should we allow that to influence our choices about treatments, preventive treatments, for example, which if you're intervening in the brain, if someone would not, in fact, develop a disease, you could be doing more harm. Neurointerventions for something that would not become a disease could actually adversely affect neuroplasticity, neurodevelopment, and could end up being harmful. We don't know yet, but I mean, these are the sorts of things that we have to keep in mind. The other thing is, suppose with the help of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we could predict with a very high degree of probability that someone would develop a neurodegenerative disease. Would it be beneficial to that person to know, to have that information? It would be beneficial if there were treatments for that disease which one could take to prevent its development and progression or to mitigate symptoms. But if there are conditions for which there are no treatments or treatments that are only marginally effective, would it be really helpful? Could it do more harm by causing anxiety to a person having that information? So these are issues that we're going to have to discuss. How much information is it beneficial for an individual, an asymptomatic individual? In fact, asymptomatic almost suggests that a person is going to develop a disease, but someone who has no symptoms and very well may not develop a disease over the course of their life. Would it really be helpful for them to have this information? I think most people would say, bioethicists would say they should have the information. It's up to them to make that decision. And so they have to weigh many things about what their interests are, what really matters in their life. But the bottom line, I think, is that they should have that information. It's just that the information raises more questions about benefit and harm than the questions that we had before the advent of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And of course, there are other issues with these two as well, but I just wanted to focus on neuroimaging. Okay, brain organoids. Okay, so I was just talking about AI. I mean, one thing, just emphasizing some of the points I made, it would be a form of precision medicine, um, patient-specific. It could improve treatment by having information about these biomarkers, um, which that could tailor treatment and could end up being more effective for these patients. But then I was just alluding to this idea about the psychological effects on people who are asymptomatic. So how is this information going to influence their decisions? Okay, brain organoids. So these are artificial tissues produced from pluripotent embryonic stem cells from a pre-implant blastocyst or induced pluripotent stem cells. So they can be infused into organs for regeneration, including the brain. Now, this is very, very experimental. There have been animal studies using these, but let's just focus on the idea of brain organoids. Suppose these could be infused through the blood-brain barrier. You could open up the blood-brain barrier, infuse these organoids into the brain. What sort of moral status would they have? If they have moral status, would that would that um, provide a prohibition against using them for this purpose, even to regenerate the brain, let's say? Would their moral status, if they have moral status, preclude all of that? So that's a big issue. Do they have moral status, and in virtue of what would they have moral status? Could they regenerate thalamocortical and cortical networks and regenerate consciousness? That is, the level of consciousness involving awareness. So, apart from the moral status, which is, I think, the biggest issue, could they lead to a revision of brain death criteria? So, for example, someone could have been declared brain dead because of the permanent cessation of all integrated brain functions, and yet experimentally, a researcher could infuse organoids into the brain, which could regenerate regions of the brain associated with awareness. That's not probable right now, but it is possible. Could that make us at least reconsider the legal and medical criteria of death? Okay, neural rights. This goes back to my the slide that I showed about the anonymous article from the participant in the brain imaging trial. So quite a bit's been written about this lately. The first, as far as I know, was by a neuroscientist, Rafael Yuste, who in colleagues they published It's Time for Neural Rights, New Human Rights for the Age of Neurotechnology. So this is information from individuals' brains from different types of imaging. Like that person whose incidental finding was accessed by and distributed by unauthorized third parties. This information should be protected to protect the privacy and they would say neural rights of the individual. Now, there have been initiatives to protect this, which is very significant. For example, in 2021, well, in the early 2020s, okay, the Chilean Constitution, they, consistent with, I think, Articles 1 and 3 of their Constitution, they ruled that a company that had accessed information about a former senator's brain it was illegal what they did. And the Chilean Supreme Court ruled in favor of this senator. And it was the first instance of an actual legislative act to protect neural rights, information about an individual's brain. Since then, the Australian Human Rights Commission has come up with recommendations. Also in the United States, Colorado and California have integrated, well, it's not legislation, but they've integrated this idea of neural rights into policies. So this is the idea of protecting information about people's brains. Now, for me, neural information is not the same as mental information, and mind and brain are they interact. Mine emerges from brain, so it's not identical to it. So I think there hasn't been as much care in discussing the differences between mental privacy and brain or neural privacy. But I think these initiatives are very good in just protecting um, the privacy and confidentiality that is between a patient and their provider, healthcare provider, regarding information of the brain. Okay, BCI's neural prosthetics. Usually these are like robotic arms, prosthetic limbs, exoskeletons. They're usually linked to a brain-computer interface. So the user will um, um, using their thoughts, this is another example of mind-brain interaction, to activate brain signals in the motor cortex and associated areas of the brain. And these send electrical signals from the brain to a computer, which produces motor output. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically the idea. So the brain's connected to a computer through a neural implant. Usually some sort of an implant in the brain. They have been developing non-invasive forms. For example, based on electroencephalography, where the sensors would be on the scalp, they wouldn't actually be in the brain. So the fact that they can do this non-invasively resolves some of the medical and legal risks and issues. So it's turning thoughts into actions, into movements. Individuals with quadriplegia or limb loss, they can turn thoughts into actions by moving a computer cursor, prosthetic limb, or a robotic arm by activating brain signals. Now, the other thing that's interesting is it's not just moving one's a limb or an artificial arm or a robotic hand, but communication. I think this would be really significant if they could do it. It has been done on some level so far. That is, individuals in the minimally conscious state or with um, motor neuron disease, they may be able to communicate by operating a computer typepad. For example, back in 2016, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. There was a group of researchers in the Netherlands and who did a study. Actually, it was a pilot study. A woman who had advanced ALS, motor neuron disease, who could not speak, used a brain-computer interface, and she had a computer typepad on her wheelchair to type out a certain number of letters. It was very basic, very minimal, but it did suggest that people could, with advances in the technology, those who had the cognitive capacity but motor incapacity, they could overcome the motor incapacity by using their preserved cognitive resources to communicate in these ways by producing letters and words. Now, there is an issue about how reliable that is, how consistent. And if we're talking about life and death decision making, if a healthcare provider, an intensivist were to ask a patient, do you want to continue artificial hydration and nutrition? Well, that's a very momentous question and decision. Would a patient with that kind of primitive ability to communicate through the brain-computer interface be able to give that sort of a response? So this is the sort of thing that James Burnett, the neurologist, and others have been discussing. But it looks as though the technology will advance to the point where people can do that. And it's a good example of an enabling technology where um, it's not, individuals are not reduced to just parts of a machine, but they're actually using it to express their human side, actually, their thoughts, their interests, their values. So there is an active role by the user in these. Now, on this issue, many people do think that neurotechnology, or they're concerned that neurotechnology will threaten certain aspects of our humanity, of our human agency. And the Royal Society in 2019, this is just one example, in their publication, I, Human, Blurring Lines Between Mind and Machine, raised this question. If we use neural interfaces to do something, is it us as human beings doing it, or is it the technology? So, I mean, this raises questions about the implications for human agency. And how much control do we really have of our actions if they're mediated by a machine? And there are different experiences. Ian Burkert is a quadriplegic, and he used the brain-computer interface with connections to his limb, to his right arm and his hand and fingers to move them. And he initially had grasp and reach. He didn't have touch. But in further developments of the technology, he now has touch. So it's a good example. But it's interesting. He said that he had to work really, really hard to get the computer to recognize his mental and his neural signals. So there's definitely a role from the human in this um, example. And the other individual was paraplegic and had a brain spine interface with implants in his legs. And he was able to move. But interestingly, he said when he moved, there's something, it felt very alien to him. So his proprioception, well, somatosensory feedback was not quite right. So his interoception, his proprioception wasn't quite right. And that gave him some sense of alienation. Not that that certainly wasn't the intention of the researchers, but it's just an example of how the technology has to advance further. But again, the goal is one that's going to enable individuals who have been limited in their motor and cognitive capacity by brain injury, by limb loss, that it can enable them to activate, to be agents, to recover a significant um, extent of their agency. So, but there are different experiences, and this idea of how the implants, how brain-computer interfaces affect um, interoception, proprioception, exteroception is an important issue, and that's something that's going to continue to be an issue. So I would say, actually, this idea of shared control is something that is not mine. Um, I recall a bioengineer, Jose Millan, who I believe is now in Texas. He used this idea. He said there's shared control between the user and the machine. And that shared control is enough for effective agency. They are limited given the injury that they have, but this is an example where the machine doesn't prevent them from doing things, but actually allows them to do certain things and restore their agency to some degree. So there's brain-mind-machine interaction. We shouldn't think of these in dualistic terms, which I think the Royal Society was at least suggesting. There's equal weight given to each. These are forms of extended embodiment. It's not as though we are embodied in the machine as something else, but they're all integrated. The individual can identify with the prosthetic when it enables them to plan and complete actions. Okay. So you could say that the machine can become humanized as part of their self. In addition to translating intentions into actions, the successful operation of the system depends on the user's patience, attention, and other psychological properties. And I mention this because it's another way of emphasizing the mental aspect of the individual user. It depends on neurobiology. It depends on certain brain functions, but it's not reducible to them. There's a phenomenological psychological aspect of this which can't be explained away by neurobiology. Okay, brain jacking. This is something which is a concern not just with brain-computer interfaces, but also deep brain stimulation. And whenever there's an implant, there's also the possibility of third parties, not well-intentioned third parties, interfering with the signals in these systems. So it's brain jacking. Laurie Pycroft and colleagues first wrote about this. There was a follow-up by Jonathan Pugh and Pycroft and others, I think 2 years later, and I think it was Science and Engineering Ethics. So it's third parties will interfere with electrical signals through vectors from an external source. So they can disrupt the user's intention to thwart an action that they want to perform, or they can force them to perform an unintended action, Again, privacy and confidentiality of information on the brain implant. Again, it emphasizes this need for neural rights to protect neural rights and legislation to protect it. Now, as I said this earlier, there are less invasive non-implantable systems that may allay some of these fears, but they still will raise some of the similar issues about privacy and confidentiality. Okay, so some future directions. How can neuroethics contribute to global mental health? And I know Father Alberto has been working on this. This, I think, is important. Neuroethics, the literature, the issues that I've discussed have not been broad enough they have not yet engaged with these issues. And I think this is one of the directions it should go in. We need a better understanding of how ecological crises contribute to neuropsychiatric disorders and how medical and social issues can prevent or control them. We're not just talking about the brain here, but brain, mind, environment interaction. And we should adopt in the way we address these issues a biopsychosocial approach. Okay, so concluding remarks. We're not essentially our brains. Um, Normative and empirical explanations and discussions should go hand in hand, but one is not reducible to the other. Our mental life necessarily depends on and emerges from, but is not reducible to, that is, it cannot be completely explained in terms of. Again, we are psychosocial beings. Um, a quote that I think captures everything I've been saying is something that I found in Stephen Rose. Stephen Rose is a biologist. He died recently, I think just a few weeks ago, from 2005, from his book, The Future of the Brain. And this passage from his book captures it all for me. He says, "We are a bunch of neurons. We are also, in part by virtue of possessing those neurons, humans with," I think I missed this. Um, anyway, it's precisely because we are biosocial organisms, because our minds are constituted through the evolutionary, developmental, historical interaction of our bodies and brains with the social and natural worlds that surround us, that we retain responsibility for our actions, that we as humans possess the agency to create and recreate our worlds. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Glannon, for this fascinating overview of nowadays neuroethics. I guess you cover all the topics, and that also I recommend all Glennon's books for sure, and all your articles. But there's one that I love most is Brain, Body, and Mind, Neuroethics with a Human Face. And I have just a question for you related to brain
Only
organ.
one.
No. There's so many questions, but if you wanted to stop sharing, Walter, sorry,
Okay. Yeah.
because we are.
Okay,
Oh,
good.
thank you. Yes. No, related to the topic of brain organoids, because it seems to me that some neuroethicists want to extend some rights or some precautions or rights to the brain organoids, but seems to me that they miss the point that you stress in some of your books and works, that our mind and brain are not identical, of course, but in this emergence of the mind, um, also this emergent vision also implied all the other organs and systems, like the immune system, the endocrine systems, etc. So it seems to me that the brain, the organoids in vitro is not, it's just neurons, right? Also,
Mhm.
they lack also the microglia, right? And they lack all the other organ systems and apparatus. So, what do you think about like putting um, some constrictions to scientific research to brain organoids, that we can use organoids just well used, I guess, to try drugs, to study the development of pancreatic organoids, for
Mhm.
example, but also for brain organoids, right? What do you think? Uh, are you agree with me that something is missing this view? It's, if not, it's just materialism, right? That consciousness emerged from the complexity of just the neurons.
Yeah. Okay. So, whether, okay, to me, saying that something has moral status, I'm not sure that's the same as saying that thing has moral rights or neural rights. So something, even if something doesn't have a right, if it has moral status, that implies certain obligations of how others treat that. Okay. So neural tissue itself, to me, does not have a right. It's the individual who develops well, it's like a in the early stages of development, a human being, there are certain tissues that there's a moral status there. I wouldn't say, um, I mean, there are rights, but the right to privacy or confidentiality about information relating to the brain to me is something that emerges or develops later on in the development of that organism. Um, so actually, one thing we need to do is, and you're pointing to this, is to, when we're talking about the obligations of researchers, first of all, sketch out, distinguish, what are the main issues here? Um, how can we distinguish a brain organoid from a pancreatic organoid or a cardiac organoid? And I mean, if all the systems in the body interact with the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, it seems implausible to just exclude them, but researchers have to clarify exactly what are the senses in which they interact. And given that interaction, um, how do we explain and separate or tease out all the ethical issues here, like about moral value or rights, moral status? Um, so, yeah, I think the ethical literature, I think it's okay so far. I think more needs to be done in clarifying, making distinctions and clarifying just how these things are related, interrelated, or maybe not related.
Thank you. And also the other great book that I share also with some colleagues dealing with our project on psychiatric disorders was your book titled Psychiatric Neuroethics, right? Studies in Research and Practice. So the Catherine von Burtur, the director of the California State Hospital, enjoyed reading your book.
Oh,
So
really? Oh,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
nice.
yeah.
I thought you were the only one who read
No, no.
it.
No, we have this big project um, dealing with especially schizophrenic patients, but I guess the model from neuroscience to policy and the neuroethics as a bridge between neuroscience and policy starts helping the dialogue between the clinician and the policymaker, right? Because as you said that there's a burden, right? I touch this problem in Skid Row in Los Angeles, and we visit also the Twin Tower Correctional Facilities in Los Angeles. Was unbelievable. So I guess also linked there's a lot of factor, right? But from the pandemic and also other epigenetic factors,
Yes.
um, I guess there's a lot of there's an increased number of psychiatric disorders, right?
Yeah.
And
It's, you mentioned Los Angeles.
yeah,
Vancouver is is
yeah,
uh, is is really having a problem. Well, has
okay,
for years, but it's gotten worse. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
There's okay. No, there's a lot of questions, but times
I'm sorry,
I
did I
can.
talk for too long?
No, 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 no. Thank you very much. Not too long, but I don't want to take your time. No, thank you very much. And I'm going to read your last book that come up just
Yeah.
the.
Some of the material is from other books. So
Okay,
it's meant to be an introduction to for people maybe who haven't
okay,
who don't know that
okay,
much. So yeah, so I go back to like it's an overview of neuroethics in the last 25 years. Yeah, yeah.
okay.
So,
Great.
so,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
some of the material you'll say, "Hey, I saw this somewhere before." Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I did get permission from the other
Of
books that
course,
were.
yes, yes, yes. Last question, last question. It For you, which is the most critical neuroethical subject in nowadays context?
Um, Psychiatry,
Okay,
psychiatric disorders,
psychiatry.
mental illness. It's the main global burden of disease, and yet very little has been discussed in neuroethics about it. But there
Yeah,
is a need. Yeah. The other topics they catch people's attention maybe more readily, but this is yeah,
yeah,
I think
like
mental
yeah,
illness. That's yeah, yeah.
yeah. There's a
Global the what we can do to reduce the global burden of mental illness. So that to me is it. And it's been, well, not entirely, but largely neglected, I think, in the neuroethics literature. Yeah. Which is why I was so pleased to hear what you were doing in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Yeah.
thank you. So stay in touch.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And
Yeah.
thank you again for inviting me. Thank you.
No, thank you. No, thank you very much.
And very good to see you again.
Yeah, I too. So,
Yeah.
thank you very much for the people that are connected through this webinar. Thank you for being with us this evening and this morning for you, Walter. But there's people connect for over all over the world.
Oh, okay.
Europe, South America, North America, Asia. There's people writing me from Mexico,
Oh,
from Hong
goodness. Yes.
Kong, from so we are from all part of the world. So thank you very much,
Thank you.
and see you soon.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
have a great time for Christmas.
Thank you. You too. Okay. Thank you, Father. Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
Okay. Bye. Goodbye.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
So thank you very much for everybody. And so stay in touch and our follow, please, if you don't know our Neurobioethics Research Group, you could follow our Facebook Neurobioethics and also our Instagram neurobioethics in Instagram. And also you can also share your opinions and also view our works in this field. The Neurobioethics Research Group, here based in Rome, is an international, interdisciplinary, and also interreligious research group dealing with neuroethics. That is the systematic reflection dealing with neuroscience, neurodata, but also the interpretation of the neuroscientific findings. So mix all this deeply philosophical reflection dealing both with ethics of neuroscience and neuroscience of ethics. So thank you very much for being with us this evening and have a good weekend. Bye.